and she will be presenting a study that she did with Tony Butler, which is the role of mental health treatment in preventing offending behaviour.
Thank you, Neil. Good afternoon, everyone. This is a joint presentation with Tony Butler, but he's not here today. As you know, Tony is the program head of the Justice Health Research Program at Kirby Institute. First, I would like to acknowledge all the investigators of the project from University of New South Wales, Butler, Corrective Services, and New South Wales Health. And in particular, I would like to thank Olayan Al-Balawi, who is a PhD student and a statistician, and he has done the analysis for the studies that I present today. The project is partly funded by the New South Wales Mental Health Commission. Today, I present two sub-studies using data from a data linkage project to examine the relationship between psychosis and offending. The first sub-study examines the impact of diversion program on reducing reoffending among those with psychosis, and the second one, regardless of having court order for treatment, having contact with health services on reducing reoffending. For those of you with little background in mental health, psychosis is a syndrome found in mental disorders such as schizophrenia, delusional disorders, bipolar mood disorder, and some form of severe depression. And the syndrome comprises symptoms including profound disturbance of thought, perception, and behavior. The prevalence of psychosis in Australia is estimated as 4.5 per thousand people in public health sector annually. However, the cost of psychosis to the public health sector is 4 times higher than health expenditure for an average Australian. Psychosis is known to be a risk factor for offending behavior and in particular violent behavior. However, the extent of association between psychosis and offending varies in different jurisdictions depending on the availability of the resources, the treatment practices, and the legal considerations. Also, the reported studies have different effect size for the association between psychosis and offending, depending on the study methods, sample size, how the comparison group were chosen, how the cohort were chosen from the community or hospital settings, and how psychosis were measured. So in New South Wales, a need was felt to conduct a study to actually examine the relationship between psychosis and offending at population level to inform policy and practice. At Kirby Institute, currently we are on a population-based study is underway using several data linkage study to examine a range of events for people with psychosis from the time that they're diagnosed to the time that they have contact with criminal justice system and after release. This study includes all individuals with psychosis between 2001, July 2001 to end of 2012, who were admitted to hospital or presented to emergency department. And psychosis was identified based on ICD code at the time of diagnosis and grouped into schizophrenia and related psychosis, affective psychosis, and substance-related psychosis. For each person in the cohort, 2 people were selected as control by year of birth and sex from a pool of data from New South Wales Health for about 12 million people, and the data linkage was done by Cheryl, Center for Linkage. The primary outcome was having at least one record of offending in the Boxar's Statistics and Research Reoffending Database ROD between July 2001 and December 2012. This slide shows the list of the data that were linked for this study, and I said the data linkage was done by the Center for Health Record Linkage. And in this diagram, I show you the data sets, the data collections that we use for the studies that I present today. We identified the people with psychosis for those who were admitted to hospital from admitted patient data collection, APDC, emergency department data collection, ADDC. We used both APDC and ADDC and the mental health ambulatory data collection for the treatment that they received for mental illness and the type of contact that they had with health services. We use reoffending the reoffending database to identify offending records and also the court outcome records, and we matched our data based on the people who died using the New South Wales health data records. So the first sub-analysis was done to examine the impact of the court diversion program on reoffending for people with diagnosis, and this study is recently published in the British Journal of Psychiatry for those of you who are interested. In Australia, the diversion program is called the New South Wales Community and Court Liaison Service. And it was established in late 90s, and currently it operates in 20 courts across New South Wales. The aim is to identify people with psychosis, with mental illness, with serious mental illness, and help the magistrates in their decision making to move them away from contact with criminal justice system to treatment. This program was not evaluated before comprehensively, and however, previous studies in overseas and in Australia in a small scale showed good results in reducing reoffending. This slide shows how the number of people who were diverted into treatment increased through time from 2001 to 2012. So this was our study. We used New South Wales health data and for people who, for diagnosis of the people, and the records for treatment, and also the Boxar data for reoffending and court outcomes between 2011 and 2012. Our treatment group were those who were those with psychosis who were diverted into the program for their first principal offence, and a comparison group were those who were not diverted. Instead, they got these penalties: bond, community order, fine, probation, suspended sentence, that we call them punitive sanction for the purpose of this study. And outcomes of our interest were incidence of second offence, time to the second offence, and predictors of the second offence. Descriptive analysis was used to compare the characteristics of the people who were diverted and the people in the comparison group. Also, survival analysis and Cox regression model were used to examine time to reoffend and predictors of reoffending. In total, there were 7,743 people in the cohort. 26% of them were diverted, and 47% received punitive sanction. Same number of men and women in both groups. Indigenous people were less among those who were diverted. Schizophrenia and related psychosis were more in those who were diverted. People who were not diverted and received punitive sanction, there were a high proportion among those had substance-related psychosis, 27% versus 7%, and more people in the diverted group had violent offence compared to the punitive sanction group. Half of those who received punitive sanction reoffended during the study period, and reoffending was 12% less for those who were diverted. We've done the analysis by sex, and we found that both for men and women, incidence of reoffending was less for those who were diverted compared to the comparison group. The analysis was done by type of diagnosis of psychosis, and for all three types of psychosis, reoffending was less for those who were diverted compared to the other group. Analysis also was done by type of offence, and both for violent and non-violent offence, incidence was less for the diverted group. For those who reoffended, the time to reoffend was longer for the diverted group, for both men and women. The same result by type of psychosis, and the same for the type of first offence, being violent or non-violent offence. The predictors for reoffending were having schizophrenia and related psychosis, substance-related psychosis, having younger age, aboriginality, not being married, and first principal offence being non-violent. So in conclusion, we found that the diversion did work in reducing reoffending. However, less people from Indigenous background were in the treatment group, and we hope that the result from this study will help magistrates in their very complex decision-making, because they need to consider the seriousness of the offence, offence history, the confidence in mental health service, and adherence of the person with the offender to stay in treatment program. So we hope this study will help the magistrates in their informed decision making. The second sub-analysis that we've done was, regardless of having treatment or having contact with services for treatment being ordered by court or not. And for this analysis, we used the data from 2001 to 2005 for those who had non-custodial sentence or no penalty with psychosis. The treatment group, the follow-up group, the period of follow-up was between July 2001 to December 2008, and we chose that follow-up period to give at least 3 years' time to examine reoffending. The treatment group were those who had contact with clinical services, hospital admission, community mental health services, or emergency department, and the comparison group had no clinical contact during the follow-up period. The analysis was the same as the previous study, and the outcomes of interest were also the same as previous. In this cohort, we had 2,724 people, men almost the same in both groups, Indigenous people, same proportion in both groups, those who had clinical contact and those who didn't. However, those with schizophrenia and related with psychosis had more contact with clinical services, and we found that a significant proportion, 28%, had no contact with clinical services during the follow-up versus 14% who had clinical contact. And violent offence was higher for those who had contact with clinical services. 18.8% of the cohort were dismissed by the court for mental illness. However, 7% of the cohort had contact with clinical services, and the median time of the first contact with services from the time of first offence and to the time of the first contact was 50 days. Of those who had contact with clinical services, just over half of them, the contact happened at community mental health service. 47% were admitted to hospital, and 1% had emergency department contact. The median number of clinical contacts during the follow-up was 20 times. 30% had zero contact with clinical services, and 28% had 41 or more contacts. Most contacts during the follow-up happened at the community mental health services. That's a good news. That means they were planned. And hospital admission was 3.4%, and emergency department were 0.4%. The predictors for having contact with health services was having schizophrenia and related psychosis. 77% of those who had schizophrenia and related psychosis did have contact with health services. However, as you see, 28% of those who had no clinical contact with with health services for mental health treatment had substance-related psychosis. And there were more people who had no non-violent offence in no-contact group versus contact group. So reoffending was 44% less in those with clinical contact for mental health treatments compared to those who had no contact. And as you see, the incidence of reoffending was less for those who had clinical contact compared to those who had no contact. And the time to reoffend was longer for those who had contact with services for treatment of mental health problems versus those who had no contact. The analysis was also done by type of violence, again the same results. The predictors for reoffending for men and women, younger age, for women having substance-related psychosis, for men non-violent offence, and you, as you saw before, having contact had reduced reoffending, and also we found the higher number of contact with clinical services reduced the risk of reoffending. We did the analysis based on type of offence. Again, younger age was a risk factor both for violent and non-violent offenders. Aboriginality was a risk factor for reoffending for violent offenders. And again, number of treatment, the higher number of treatment decreased the risk of reoffending both for violent and non-violent offenders. So in conclusion, in our cohort, 19% had a court order for treatment, but as you saw before, the number of people who received court order increased from 2001 to 2012. 70% had clinical contact, most of them had clinical contacts, and most of them were planned at mental health services. And as we saw, the risk of reoffending was reduced by by clinical contacts and more clinical contacts with services. However, more attention should be paid to people with substance-related psychosis, specifically women, to use clinical services for treatment of mental health problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Armita. That gives us 15 minutes for questions. So, one over here.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering whether do we know something about the possibility that psychosis is actually developed as a consequence of incarceration, like during a prison term? And in that case, what are the appropriate treatments?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I...
Do we know whether actually imprisonment itself causes...
We didn't include people who went in prison.
Yeah,
so
I was wondering whether you...
We specifically excluded those who went into the prison. And we just looked in the first offence, the time between the first offence and the second offence. So the people who went to the prison were excluded altogether.
Hi. So when I was looking at your treatment and your control groups, and correct me if at any point I'm wrong, in the treatment group they were substantially less likely to have a substance-related psychosis. Is that right? So that strikes me as that the two groups are probably going to be a lot different in terms of their reoffending behaviour. So if you have a treatment group that comes in and maybe it's their psychosis is related to, like, say, taking ice against somebody who just comes in with a stress-related nervous breakdown or something, that might explain some of your results. I don't know, but I have maybe something you could test. If Sarah presented earlier, she used the judge as an instrument. I see no reason why you couldn't do the same thing, just as like a follow-up study or something like that.
Okay, yeah. So do you mean that like that,
Pardon?
sorry, do you mean that the further analysis to have a...
So I guess what I'm saying is that your treatment and control groups, to me, seem like they vary in a systematic way that explains your outcome. And so to me, it looks like there's some selection bias, and that might not be driving the entire result, but at least a big chunk of it. And I guess what I'm saying is you can use an instrumental variables strategy that is like sort of really commonly applied to correct that issue.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea would be the magistrates are basically the ones who decide whether you get treatment. Is that correct?
Sorry, I was
Sorry. So the magistrates, what I'm saying is because the magistrates determine whether you get treatment or not, and because...
Do you mean the first study that I've done?
Yes,
the
so inside the first study.
Sorry, I was just mixing the other
Sorry,
one.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, so the first
Also,
one,
I'm a bit like
diversion,
flustered,
yeah.
I just ran in. So what I'm saying is because the magistrates essentially decide whether you get treatment or not, you can use the magistrate's proclivity to assign treatment as an instrument to isolate the causal effect of the treatment on, like, say, reoffending behaviour. And the reason I think that's important is because your treatment group look very different to your control group. For example, the treatment group look like that when they come in for psychosis, it's not drug related, so they look like they're less likely to reoffend irrespective of the treatment.
They were all adjusted for type of psychosis. They were all adjusted, so the...
No, but I think that if you come in for, like, say, a stress-related nervous breakdown, like somebody in your treatment group, or if you come in for like a psychotic episode that's sort of correlated with ICE, those two people are very different, and just straight comparing them doesn't really seem like it's gonna. It seems like there's selection bias there. Does that make sense?
I mean, we've looked in the hazard ratio on adjusted, and we also did it adjusted, and what I presented to you today were all adjusted, and they were all adjusted by type of psychosis. So does it answer your question? Or?
No, but I think perhaps I'm missing something, but that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? One over here. Front. We'll just wait for the microphone, thanks.
Thank you. It was a bit concerning that so many people, 30%, didn't access any treatment at all. Do you think there's any implications for practice that could be learnt from your study?
So the first one, or the first study,
The mental health
diversion,
services. No,
the
mental health
diversion,
services.
26% were in the diversion, and the rest were not. So, yes. So, yes, I mean, as I said, I mean, there are so many issues that magistrates need to consider for having these people into treatment program or not. So it is a very complex decision that they need to make. I mean, the offending history by itself, how serious the offence was, and also if they believe that this person will stay in this program, yes, all these things that they need to consider, or many other things that they need to consider. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a quick one.
Yeah.
What I found very interesting, Armita, was that the more treatment episodes they had a predictive effect.
Yes, yes.
So that would sort of speak volumes for trying to keep people in treatment
Exactly.
if they stop getting it. So did you look at anything around what was predictive of that?
This is something that we want to see exactly. This is the next step that's the main question that we have. We looked into the first offence to first contact with health services, that was 50 days. And we looked at just number of treatments, but the main point, as you said, it's like if that 41 treatments happened in the first 6 months, or it was across time from 2001 to whatever else, like 2 years or 3 years, and how frequent these treatments happen. So this is the next thing that we need to consider in our analysis. No, we haven't done that, but this is something that, thank you, we do consider to do.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because in a completely different study, which we did at Boxar probably 10 or so years ago, we're looking at the effect of the heroin shortage on property crime, and what we actually found is rather than the big decline in opioid overdoses, what was predictive of the drop in property crime was re-registration for pharmacotherapy, methadone, that sort of thing. So that's that whole thing of retaining people back into treatment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure.
Question over here.
Apologies if this may have already been covered, but did any of the sample have a disability, like an intellectual disability or a cognitive impairment?
No, we didn't.
No, so they were screened
We
out.
only looked into people with psychosis,
Okay.
yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Any others? Yeah, one more.
Just wondering with the first study, so the 12% reduction for the treatment group compared to the comparison group, I'm just wondering that treatment, was it just the application of antipsychotics, or did the treatment, was it broader?
No, we just know that they had court order for treatment. That's all we know.
Oh, so we don't know the nature of that
No,
treatment?
that's what the second analysis was done to see if they had contact with services, and even that one is basically contact with services. We don't know about the details of the treatments.
Okay, let's thank Armita for presenting very interesting papers.